Hello and welcome to today's screencast. We're going to build on what we worked on in Lab 19. So in Lab 19, if you did it right, hopefully you had a very simple user registration form with first name, last name, email address, and you've got some code that allows you to register a user and save it into the database. And perhaps if you go into your Server Explorer, you could verify that the data is getting saved correctly. So you've got some sample data that looks like this. I've added some sample data. Now what we're going to do is learn how to pass data from one page to another. There's several different ways to do this. In this screencast, I'm going to focus on three different ways to do this. Using the query string, we're going to pass some value from this page 1, to another page. Then we're going to use cookies, and then we're finally going to use sessions. In your final project, you find it useful to use sessions and probably query strings, possibly cookies if you need to. You can use them for different scenarios. Review your lecture slides for a little bit more detail on when to use what. But I'll show you some examples on how to do this. This also is what Lab 20 is all about. So if you follow this tutorial and build on what you had in Lab 19, you should be in fairly good shape for Lab 20. All right, let's get started. So what I'm going to do here is once a user registers, I'm going to send them to another page. So I'm going to create a very simple page, and I'm going to name that the home page. So right click, and web form, we'll call that home. This is the home page. All right. Once you get to this page, I'm going to show you some content. I'm going to start off by adding 3 label controls just so I can illustrate this idea of passing data from one page to another. All right, so I just added 3 label controls. I'm going to go hit enter here. Let's go hit enter there. And the first one is going to be query string example. Okay, so I'm going to show you an example where I'm passing data to this page using the query string. This one is going to be cookie example. And then potentially session example. Another typo in my cookie here. Cookie needs an E, not a W. Let's make this bold, make that bold. And then let's go set some properties for these label controls. Let's format this a little bit. Make it look slightly nicer. I'm thinking of maybe that. All right, here we go. So this label control, the first label control, would have no value. It would be LBL query string. I'm simply going to pass in some data, and for the sake of illustration, I would show it in this label control. So I'll pass in some value through query string and then display it here. All right, I'll leave this guy wide open, no text. That's going to be LBL cookie. All right, and this guy is going to be LBL session. Let's get rid of the text property. Here we go. So we've got some sample coding here. So I'm going to double click the white space because I want to write some code in a page load event handler. So my goal here is to be able to pass some data from the register page. Once a user registers, I'm going to capture their email address. I'll continue to save it into the database, but I'll pass it on to the next page. Now, in the real world, it might be useful to get the ID value, the primary key. So once a user registers, you might want to save it into the database, then write a select statement to retrieve the actual ID that got created for that user. That ID might be stored in a cookie or put it in a session state. So if the user goes from one page to another, you maintain that session and you know um, which specific user that is, right? And you can go back in the database and search for user where user ID equals blah, blah, blah. All right, so that's the basic idea. So let's go back to this register now button. So this button allows you to save this to the database. And for now, I was doing register successfully. This is not realistic that we would be doing this. It's more realistic that once a user registers, we might say, thank you for registering successfully, something to that effect. But we might also redirect them to a thank you page or send them to a home page or something, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So if I want to redirect, obviously I'm going to use response.redirect. And I need to know the name of the page that I'm looking to send the user to. So let's say home.aspx. That's where I'm looking to go. Right, so in this first example, we're going to use a query string. So to use a query string, I can do home.aspx, which is this home.aspx page, and I'm going to pass in q as my parameter name, and I'm going to say q is equal to whatever the user typed in as their email address, and that is stored in txt email.text. Right, so I'm going to grab the user input. I'll save it into the database anyway, but I'll also pass it on to the next page. So I'm going to add or concatenate this, right, with that. So home.aspx, pass in q equals, actually why don't we just pass in the first name. Passing in email is a little too sensitive. Let's just pass in the first name to the next page. Right? Now, notice query strings are not going to be useful or recommended if you're passing in sensitive information. Typically, it would be useful if you're passing in the page identifier, maybe your product page in your final project. It might be useful to do something like that. Right? So if a user searches for products and they see a list of products and they click to go into one of the products, you might pass in the query string of the ID of the product, so product ID 123 to the next page, which might be the product detail page, and you would go in the database and retrieve the associated product for that ID. That's when a product, for a list of products into a product detail would be a good example for query string. This is not a perfect example, but I just want to illustrate this, how session state is maintained using query strings. All right, so this is going to construct a string, home.aspx question mark q equals this, right? So let's go ahead and do that. Let's see if that works. So now going back to my home.aspx, once this page loads, I want to write some code to retrieve what was sent to me, right? So I'm going to test first if some value was sent. So I do a request dot query string, and I need to know the exact query string and then check if this is null, right? To see if it's empty. If it's not empty, then we would get that value and we would show it in lbl query string dot text. All right, this would be equal to whatever this value is. Now I'm going to plug in. I'm going to go back to the other screen to get the actual data there so you can see what's going on here. I'll just hide that so you can see the full code. Okay, so on this page, I'm creating a query string value of Q. So Q is actually the variable name that's getting passed. So Q would be assigned a value of X, right? The first name. So Q is what I'm going to plug in here. So I'm looking for what the value of Q is. If Q is not null, then get the value of Q and show it in the label control. So that's what we're doing here. Let's go give this a shot. Actually, I'm going to close out of this page. Well, we can simulate this first. So let's let this compile. I load the home page. There is no Q value, so I show nothing. But let's do something like question mark Q equals 7. And when I hit enter, you notice number 7 is displayed here. And that's basically how query string values work. Let's say 75. Hit enter, 75. So if I created a URL that looked like this coming in, I would be able to grab that value using that sample code and display it, right? All we need to do is test if the value is not null. If it's not null, then we can use it in code for something else. Let's see if we can go through the registration page to do this now. So we're going to test register.aspx. Compile that. Now we're going to go with John Doe. John Doe would have an email of jdoe@uwex.edu. And we will register now. As soon as I click register now, that goes into the database, and now this is constructing Q equals John, and you can see John is displayed here, right? That's the magic of query string. Now let's go back in our database and make sure that actually went into the users table. So if we go back in here, we can show table data, and John Doe is in here with JDoe. So we're cooking. Life is good. All right, next example. We're now going to try to put maybe the email address in a cookie, right? So in this example, we would, to put something in a cookie, you would use response. But before we redirect, I'm going to do this before we redirect the page, right? Because it will make sense to store it before we send logic from this page to the next page. So I'm going to do response, and you've got the sample code in your slides there. Response.cookies, and then we would specify a name of the cookie. So let's say this is going to be email. All right, and we can set the dot value property equals txt email dot text, because that's, I want to get the email that the user specifically typed in. I'm going to pass that in a cookie called email, and that's good. On the subsequent page, I'm going to add logic that says when this page loads, please check if there is a cookie for this. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. So we'll do request.cookies. All right. This time it's not Q, it's going to be the name of the cookie that we set. So the name of this cookie is email. Okay, so I'm going to plug in email. And let's actually note this is for cookies. This is some sample code for query strings. These are all examples of state management options. There are lots. I'm only focusing on 3 of them. All right, so now if this is not null, meaning there is a cookie set, then show that cookie value in LBL email, LBL cookie, right? We're not gonna plug it in here. And we're gonna be doing that in the dot value. So unlike query string where I could just do this, and if I had an integer, I can cast it to an integer or parse it as an integer. By default, this is going to be a string. You can see this is going to come in as a string, so I don't need to do anything to it. It's a string, that's going to work so long as this is set. Now, obviously, you need to get the typing of this correct. So let's go back to the register page. Again, the logic is before we redirect the page, and the page is still doing query string, right? We'll pass in the first name and query string, but the email will be stored as cookie because that's a little bit sensitive and I want to hide it. So it's not visible in the URL. Let's fire this up. Code is going to compile, and we'll come up with a sample user that we want to add to the database. So now we want to add, who else? Let's say Steph Curry. All right. So scurry at uwextension.edu. Let's see if we've got some magic here. All right. So I passed in the query string Steph is the first name. I can't see the cookie out here, but you can see the cookie value got passed in as select inspect, and I can choose the application tab. Under the application tab, I would see cookies. You'd see cookies listed here. There are all kinds of different options, session storage, so on and so forth. Here are the cookies for this specific website, localhost, blah, blah, blah. And there is a name of my cookie and the value that's in my cookie. Typically, we would encrypt this so it's not easy for a user to see it, especially if it's sensitive data, but that's how cookies work, right? So cookies would be data stored in a web browser or locally for that machine, specific to that web browser, and you could see this is the value that I passed into the cookie. Pretty interesting stuff. So that's that example. Let's close this out. In fact, we can go back into our database and see if Steph Curry was added, which I would assume, and it looks like it's in here. All right, so that's good. Next example. Let's say we want to pass in the last name in the session. So to pass in a session, we would need to use session.add. So session dot add, and we would do let's say L name. This would be the variable name that I'm passing in, and the syntax is something like the name and then the value. So L name, and then in L name I can have, let's say, txt dot last name dot text, right? So I'll pass in the session. This is some code for session. This is some sample code for adding cookies. This is some sample code for passing in query string. All right, so I'm adding a session variable, L name, and in that variable name, I'm going to pass in txt last name. Let's go give it a shot. Now, I need to write some code to retrieve this. Now, this code could have been in any of the event handlers. I'm just putting it in the page load. It could be a button click or whatever it is. But this recipe is you need to first test if the value exists. If it exists, then do something with it, right? So in this example, this is how I would retrieve a session variable. My session variable name in this example is L name, okay? So I'm going to need to use L name specifically here. So I'm going to do L name here, L name there, and we're going to change this to session. So we're going to test if this session value is there. If it's there, then we would use it. Right. Okay, so if this is not null, then I'm going to do this. Give me that as a string. So I'm going to toString that because this will come in as some type of object. And then I'm going to convert it to a string. Okay, so I don't want to put this in LBL cookie. I want to put it in LBL session.text. Okay, so let's go make sure this is good. Session here, session there. This is cookie, cookie. This is query string, label query string for that, label cookie for that, label session. This is all my page load event, and I'm saying I want to add a session cookie value of blah, 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 right? So sessions are server side, whereas query string and cookies are client side. So cookies and query strings we're able to see it in the browser, right? I showed you the cookie. I also showed you the query string in the browser URL, but session variables we won't be able to see because that would be stored on the server and not on the client. All right, so let's fire this up. Now we're going to be creating a user. Let's see what a good example would be. Maybe we stick with the Golden State Warriors and say this would be Klay Thompson. Forgive me if you're not a good, if you don't like the Golden State Warriors. I'm not a huge fan, but I'm quite a fan. All right, so let's give this a shot. So now Klay comes in and the query string for first name. In the cookie is the email address, and the last name goes in the session, right? So these are just some good examples on how to use state management. I'm going to close out of this guy, distracting me. So feel free to play around with it. Use it as you see fit, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions.